A 9-year-old boy in a wheelchair carried his starving 3-year-old sister to a gas station after escaping their locked room. When the clerk saw the photos the boy took of their basement prison, she immediately hid them and called 911. The darkness had a weight to it, pressing down like a living thing that breathed with the rhythm of old pipes and settling wood. In the suffocating belly of 247 Elm Street, beneath layers of rotting floorboards and forgotten dreams, Kieran Brennan had learned to make magic from misery. The basement storage room measured exactly 12 feet by 8 feet. He had counted the concrete blocks that formed its walls during countless sleepless nights, running his small fingers along the rough mortar joints until he knew every crack and imperfection by touch. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed cord, casting harsh shadows that danced like demons across the damp walls whenever the house above creaked with winter wind. The bulb flickered constantly, a dying star in their underground universe, threatening to plunge them into complete darkness at any moment. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and despair, tinged with the metallic taste of fear that had settled into the concrete like a stain. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling in abstract patterns that Kieran had named during the long hours when sleep refused to come. The dragon's wing, the weeping lady, the storm cloud that seemed to grow larger each day as winter moisture seeped through the foundation above. "Tell me about the princess again," Iris whispered from her nest of moth-eaten blankets in the corner. At 3 years old, she had adapted to their prison with the resilience that only children possess, though her small body showed the cruel evidence of their captivity. Her once round cheeks had hollowed, creating shadows beneath her cheekbones that aged her face beyond her years. Her bright blue eyes, once sparkling with mischief and laughter, now seemed too large for her pale face, like delicate porcelain marbles set in fine china. The blankets that surrounded her were a patchwork of their former life, a purple throw from the living room sofa, a baby quilt their grandmother had made before she died, and several old towels that Fletcher had brought down during the first week of their imprisonment. They smelled of dust and abandonment, but they were warm, and warmth had become a precious commodity in their concrete tomb. Kieran adjusted his position in the manual wheelchair that had been both his legs and his anchor for most of his 9 years. The chair was ancient, inherited from some distant relative who had passed away when Kieran was barely walking age. Its vinyl seat was cracked and patched with duct tape in a dozen places, creating a map of repairs that told the story of years of hard use. The chrome on the wheels had dulled to a pewter gray, and the left brake squeaked whenever he engaged it. But it was his chariot, his mobile fortress, and in this basement tomb, it had become Iris's throne when she needed to feel safe. The spina. Bifida that had claimed the use of his legs before birth had taught Kieran early lessons about adaptation and determination. While other children ran and jumped and climbed, he had learned to navigate the world from a seated perspective, developing upper body strength that surprised adults and a problem-solving ability that came from constantly figuring out how to accomplish tasks that others took for granted. These skills, honed over years of overcoming obstacles, were now the foundation of his and Iris's survival. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a storyteller who had spun 1,000 tales to keep fear at bay. "There lived a princess who was different from all the other princesses. She didn't live in a tall tower, made of stone and mortar. She lived in a special underground palace, where she was the guardian of the most precious treasure in all the kingdoms." His voice echoed softly off the concrete walls, creating a gentle reverberation that made their small prison feel almost cathedral-like in its acoustics. Over the weeks, he had learned exactly how to pitch his voice so that it would carry warmth, without waking Fletcher if he happened to be sleeping upstairs. Every sound in this basement had to be calculated, measured, controlled. Iris giggled softly, the sound like tinkling bells in the oppressive silence. Even her laughter had changed, softer. Now, more cautious, as if she understood instinctively that loud sounds might bring unwanted attention. "What was the treasure?" "The treasure," Kieran said, wheeling his chair closer to her makeshift bed with practiced silence, the rubber wheels making barely a whisper against the cold concrete floor. Was her little sister, who had a laugh that could make flowers bloom even in the darkest places, and eyes that held all the stars in the sky. The truth was far from any fairy tale. They had been locked in this basement room for 23 days. Kieran kept careful count on a makeshift calendar scratched into the concrete wall with a bent nail he had found in one of the storage boxes. 23 days since Fletcher, Brennan, their father, had installed the heavy deadbolt on the outside of the door and declared that they needed to stay safe until he could figure things out. The deadbolt was the industrial-grade monster, the kind used on warehouse doors or storage facilities. Kieran had studied it obsessively during the early days of their captivity, running his fingers along the door frame where the metal plates had been screwed into place with long bolts that disappeared into the wooden frame. The installation had been hasty but thorough. Fletcher might have been losing his grip on reality, but his military training still showed in the methodical way he had secured their prison. Fletcher's visits had become their only connection to the world above, their sole measure of time passing in a place where day and night held no meaning. In the beginning, he came daily, bringing sandwiches wrapped in paper towels, bottles of water, and promises that their confinement was temporary. He would sit on the floor beside them, his eyes darting nervously around the room as he spoke in rapid, disjointed sentences about dangerous people who were watching the house and listening to the phones. "You understand, don't you, Kieran?" he would say, his hands shaking as he lit another cigarette from the butt of the previous one. "You're the smart one. You know I have to keep you safe. They want to take you away from me, put you in foster care, split you up. I can't let that happen. This is just temporary, just until I can figure out what to do." But as days bled into weeks, his visits grew sporadic and his explanations more incoherent. 3 days would pass without sight of him, then 5, then a terrifying week when they survived on stale crackers and rainwater that seeped through a crack in the foundation. The promises of temporary had faded into silence, replaced by the growing realization that Fletcher's definition of safety had become their definition of imprisonment. "I'm hungry, Kieran," Iris said quietly, pressing her small hand against her stomach. The admission was matter-of-fact, delivered without complaint or tears. She had learned not to cry about hunger. Tears changed nothing, and they made Kieran's face crumple with a pain she didn't want to cause. At 3 years old, she had developed a wisdom that no child should possess, an understanding that their survival depended on strength and silence. Kieran reached into the cardboard box beside his chair that served as their pantry, taking mental inventory of their dwindling supplies. 2 stale dinner rolls Fletcher had brought 4 days ago, now hard as rocks, but still edible if soaked in water. A half-empty jar of peanut butter, with barely a spoonful left, the sides scraped clean with their fingers, until no trace of the creamy protein remained. 3 packages of saltine crackers, 2 of them already opened and growing soft in the damp air. Their water supply consisted of 2 plastic bottles, one completely empty, the other containing perhaps 6 ounces of tepid liquid that tasted of plastic and desperation. He had become a master of rationing, understanding instinctively how to make their meager supplies stretch across the vast uncertainty of Fletcher's next visit. Every crumb was precious, every drop of water calculated against their survival. He had learned to ignore the constant gnawing in his own stomach, focusing instead on making sure Iris received the larger portions, the better pieces, the cleaner water. "Breakfast is served, Your Royal Highness," he announced with mock formality, tearing one of the dinner rolls into small pieces. The bread crumbled in his hands, dry as dust, but he soaked each piece in a few drops of their precious water until it became edible. He spread a thin layer of peanut butter on each piece, making their meager supplies stretch as far as possible. It was a skill he had perfected over the weeks, the mathematics of survival, calculated in calories and hope, measured in the growing hollowness of Iris's cheeks and the increasing prominence of her ribs beneath her thin clothing. Iris crawled from her blanket nest with the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy. Her small limbs moved with deliberate precision as she made her way across the few feet of concrete floor that separated them. She climbed onto Kieran's lap, settling against his chest like a bird seeking warmth, her small body fitting perfectly in the space his arms created. Despite his own hunger, he gave her the larger portions, watching as she nibbled each piece slowly, making it last, savoring every molecule of nutrition. The darkest circumstances. The question pierced Kieran's heart like a blade. Fletcher's last visit had been different, wild-eyed and rambling, his speech more erratic than ever. He had brought them a loaf of bread and 2 cans of soup, setting them down on the floor with shaking hands before launching into a paranoid monologue about surveillance equipment and government tracking. When Kieran had pointed out that they had no can opener for the soup, Fletcher had stared at him blankly for several long seconds, his eyes unfocused and distant, before turning and leaving without another word. The deadbolt had clicked into place with its familiar finality, and they had listened to his footsteps retreating up the basement stairs, fading into the silence above. That was 4 days ago. 4 days of watching Iris grow weaker. 4 days of rationing their diminishing supplies. 4 days of wondering if Fletcher would ever return or if they would simply be forgotten in their concrete tomb. Maybe, Kieran said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood that false hope could be crueler than honest uncertainty. But first, we need to make sure you stay strong and healthy. That's the most important job a princess has, taking care of herself so she can take care of her kingdom. As Iris ate with the slow deliberation of someone making every bite count, Kieran's eyes wandered to the object hidden beneath his seat cushion, an old smartphone. He had discovered in one of the storage boxes during their 2nd week of captivity. The phone was ancient by modern standards, probably 8 or 9 years old, with a spider web of cracks across its screen and a battery that held barely any charge. The plastic case was faded and worn, suggesting years of heavy use before it had been retired to this basement storage. But miracle of miracles, it still functioned. The discovery had been accidental. He had been exploring the storage boxes out of boredom, searching for anything that might help them pass the time or improve their situation. Most of the boxes contained useless items, old tax documents, Christmas decorations, outdated electronics that no longer worked. But buried beneath a pile of tangled extension cords, he had found the phone, along with a compatible charging cable that had given him the most precious gift of all, documentation. He had been using it sparingly, taking photographs when he was certain Iris was sleeping and Fletcher was nowhere in the house above. The phone had no service in the basement. The concrete walls and underground location made any kind of cellular connection impossible, and the battery was nearly dead, despite his attempts to conserve power. But those photographs were becoming something more important than entertainment or memory keeping. They were evidence, proof, testimony that would speak for them if their voices were ever silenced. In the harsh light of the flickering bulb, working, with the methodical precision of someone who understood that every shot counted, he had documented their imprisonment. Pictures of the deadbolt mechanism visible from inside the room, showing clearly how it could only be opened from the outside. The heavy metal plates and industrial-grade construction that made escape impossible through conventional means. Photos of their deteriorating living conditions, the bucket in the corner that served as their makeshift toilet, a humiliating necessity that violated every sense of dignity and privacy. The growing pile of empty food containers that told the story of Fletcher's increasingly sporadic visits. The calendar marks scratched into the concrete wall, each line a testimony to another day of captivity. Most importantly, and most heartbreakingly, he had taken pictures of Iris over the past weeks, showing her gradual transformation from a healthy, chubby toddler with round cheeks and bright eyes to the thin, pale child who now rested against his chest. The progression was subtle day by day, but stark and undeniable when viewed in sequence. Her face had grown gaunt, her eyes larger and more prominent as the flesh around them diminished. Her clothing hung loose where it had once hugged her small body snugly. If anything happened to them, if Fletcher never returned, if their situation deteriorated beyond the point of survival, these photographs would tell their story. Someone, somewhere, would look at these images and understand that what had happened to them was not accident or neglect, but deliberate imprisonment. The photos would speak for them when they could no longer speak for themselves. "Kieran?" Iris's voice was drowsy now, the small meal having satisfied her enough to bring on the sleepiness that had become her primary escape from their reality. "Yes, little bird?" The pet name had emerged naturally during their captivity, inspired by the way she nested in her blankets and the delicate bird-like quality of her movements as she grew weaker. "Are we safe here?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and complicated, loaded with meanings that a 3-year-old couldn't possibly understand but somehow sensed. How could he explain to someone so young that their father, the man who was supposed to be their protector and guardian, had become their captor? How could he tell her that their safety depended entirely on the increasingly unstable whims of someone whose grip on reality seemed to slip further with each passing day? How could he admit that he lay awake at night, listening to the sounds from above, trying to determine Fletcher's location and mood by the pattern of his footsteps, the opening and closing of doors, the occasional sound of breaking glass or furniture being moved? How could he explain the fear that twisted in his stomach every time he heard Fletcher's voice upstairs, sometimes talking to invisible people, sometimes shouting at enemies that existed only in his troubled mind? "We're together," he said finally, settling on the one truth that seemed unshakable in their uncertain world. "And as long as we're together, we're going to be okay. That's what families do. They take care of each other, no matter what." Iris nodded against his chest, accepting this explanation with the absolute faith that children reserve for their heroes. To her, Kieran was invincible, capable of solving any problem and conquering any fear. She had no way of knowing that he spent his sleepless hours calculating their remaining food supply, trying to devise escape plans that his wheelchair made seemingly impossible, and fighting down the terror that threatened to overwhelm him when he considered what would happen if Fletcher never returned. He prayed she would never discover how terrified he really was, how often he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out in frustration and fear, how many nights he had stared at the ceiling and wondered if they would die in this basement, forgotten and alone. As she drifted toward sleep, her breathing settling into the rhythm that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, Kieran carefully extracted the hidden phone from beneath his cushion. The device felt impossibly precious in his hands, this piece of technology that represented their only connection to the world beyond their concrete walls. The battery icon showed critical levels, maybe enough power for a few more photos, but certainly not enough for any attempt at communication, even if there had been signal in their underground tomb. He powered on the device with the reverent care of someone handling a religious artifact, waiting for the cracked screen to illuminate and show him the camera function. In the dim, flickering light of their single bulb, he took several shots. Iris sleeping peacefully despite their dire circumstances. Her small face relaxed in a way that made her look even younger and more vulnerable. The nearly empty food supplies, arranged on the floor like an exhibit in a museum of deprivation. The calendar marks scratched into the concrete wall, each line a testament to their endurance and Fletcher's abandonment. Each photograph was deliberate, methodical, composed with the precision of someone who understood that these images might be their only legacy. If these photos ever saw the light of day, they needed to tell a complete story without explanation or context. Someone looking at them should understand immediately that this was not neglect born of poverty or unfortunate circumstances, but systematic imprisonment, deliberate isolation, criminal confinement. The phone's screen flickered a low battery warning, and Kieran quickly powered it down, tucking it back into its hiding place beneath his seat cushion with the careful movements of someone concealing treasure. 23 photos now lived in that device, 23 pieces of evidence that could save their lives if anyone ever found them. 23 silent witnesses to their suffering. But first, they had to survive long enough for those photographs to matter. Outside their basement prison, the February wind howled through the eaves of the old house with a sound like grief itself, rattling windows and sending bare branches, scraping against the siding like skeletal fingers clawing for entry. The sound had once frightened Iris during their first nights of captivity, but now it was simply part of their world's soundtrack, as familiar as the dripping pipe in the corner that marked time with its steady rhythm, or the electrical hum of their dying light bulb that flickered like a candle in a cathedral. The house above them creaked and settled with the sounds of abandonment. Sometimes Kieran could hear Fletcher moving around, the heavy tread of his boots on the kitchen floor, the slamming of cabinet doors, the occasional crash of something breaking. But more often, there was only silence, stretching for hours or days, leaving them to wonder if they had been completely forgotten or if Fletcher had simply disappeared into whatever reality his troubled mind had created. Kieran looked down at his sleeping sister, her face peaceful in a way that made his heart ache with love and determination. In sleep, she looked exactly like the healthy, happy child she had been just weeks ago, before their world had collapsed into this basement nightmare. Her breathing was steady and even, her small hand curled against his chest in absolute trust. He made a silent promise to that sleeping child, a vow that echoed off the concrete walls of their prison and settled into his bones like an oath sworn before God. Whatever it took, however impossible it seemed, however many obstacles his wheelchair and their circumstances placed in his path, he would find a way to get her out of this basement. His mobility might be limited, his small body might lack the physical strength of an adult, but his mind was sharp, and his love for Iris was stronger than any lock Fletcher could install, any deadbolt he could secure, any fear he could instill. In the growing darkness of their 23rd day of captivity, as Iris's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of exhausted sleep, as the wind outside sang its mournful song through the bones of their prison house, Kieran Brennan began to plan their escape. The princess, he decided, watching the shadows dance across the concrete walls, was about to rescue herself. And she was going to take her little sister with her, no matter what it cost, no matter how impossible it seemed. Because that's what families do. They take care of each other, even when the world falls apart around them, even when the people who should protect them become the very danger they need to escape. Especially then. The 27th day dawned, without dawn in their windowless world, marked only by the subtle shift in the house's rhythm above them. Kieran had learned to read the building's moods like a sailor reads the sea, the way the pipes sang different songs depending on the time of day, how the electrical current hummed with varying intensity, the pattern of settling sounds that indicated whether Fletcher was moving around upstairs or had fallen into one of his deep, drug-induced sleeps. This morning, there was only silence. A silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. Iris had not spoken since yesterday evening. She lay curled in her nest of blankets, her breathing shallow and rapid, her skin carrying a grayish pallor that made Kieran's chest tighten with panic. When he had tried to wake her an hour ago for their morning ritual of shared breakfast, she had opened her eyes, but seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if he were made of glass and she could see something more interesting beyond. "Little bird," he whispered, wheeling his chair as close to her as possible. "How are you feeling this morning?" She turned her head toward him with the slow, deliberate movement of someone conserving every ounce of energy. Her lips were dry and slightly cracked, and when she tried to smile, that brave, automatic smile she had maintained throughout their captivity, it seemed to cost her tremendous effort. "Tired," she whispered, the word barely audible. "So tired, Kieran." The admission hit him like a physical blow. Iris had never complained about being tired before, never admitted to weakness or discomfort beyond hunger. She had been their source of light in this darkness, the reason he could spin fairy tales and find hope in hopeless circumstances. To hear her voice so small, so defeated, was like watching their last candle flicker toward extinction. Kieran reached into their dwindling supply box with hands that trembled slightly. One dinner roll remained, now so stale it could probably be used as a weapon. The peanut butter jar was completely empty. He had scraped every molecule from its sides 2 days ago. 2 packages of saltine crackers, both opened, both growing soft and stale in the damp air. And their water, perhaps 4 ounces of tepid liquid in the bottom of their last bottle. 4 ounces of water for 2 people, with no idea when Fletcher might return. The mathematics of survival had become brutal in their simplicity. At Iris's current rate of deterioration, she had perhaps 48 hours before dehydration became life-threatening, maybe less. Her small body was already showing signs of severe malnutrition, the hollowed cheeks, the prominent ribs, the way her clothing hung like drapes on a too small frame. "I'm going to make you something special for breakfast," he said, forcing cheerfulness into his voice while his mind raced through calculations and possibilities. A feast fit for a princess. He soaked pieces of the stale dinner roll in their precious water until they became edible, then arranged them on a plastic plate he had found in one of the storage boxes. To make the meal seem more substantial, he broke the crackers into small pieces and arranged them around the bread like garnish around a gourmet dish. It was pathetic, a mockery of nutrition that wouldn't satisfy a mouse. But it was all they had. Iris accepted the food with the mechanical obedience of someone whose appetite had been replaced by pure survival instinct. She chewed slowly, methodically, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that held more interest than the concrete walls of their prison. Each swallow seemed to require conscious effort, as if her body were forgetting how to perform the basic functions of living. Watching her fade, Kieran felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The careful optimism he had maintained for 27 days, the belief that Fletcher would return and this nightmare would end, the faith that someone would eventually come looking for them, all of it crumbled like the stale bread in Iris's small hands. They were going to die in this basement. The realization came with crystalline clarity, accompanied by a cold calm that surprised him. Fletcher was not coming back. Whether he had fled town, overdosed in some alley, or simply forgotten they existed in whatever paranoid reality he now inhabited, the result was the same. 2 children locked in a basement room with no way out and no one looking for them. Unless he did something about it. Kieran had been studying the door mechanism obsessively since their imprisonment began, running his fingers along the frame during the long hours when Iris slept, testing the give in the wood, examining every screw and bolt with the methodical attention of an engineer. The deadbolt was industrial grade, designed to keep people out, or in, but it had been installed hastily, mounted on a door frame that was old and softened by decades of moisture and neglect. More importantly, Fletcher's military precision had been compromised by whatever substances were eating away at his sanity. The installation was thorough, but not perfect. There were gaps, weaknesses, small flaws that might be exploited by someone with enough time, determination, and desperation. The biggest weakness was also the most ironic. Fletcher's concern for their comfort had led him to leave them with boxes of storage items that included tools. Not obvious tools, no hammers or screwdrivers that might have made escape simple, but improvised implements that could serve the same purpose in the right hands. A bent wire coat hanger, a metal spatula with a broken handle, a collection of screws and bolts from some long-forgotten furniture assembly project. Most importantly, there was the broken spoon handle he had been using to mark their calendar. The metal was old but strong, worn to a sharp edge that could be used for prying, scraping, or wedging. In the hands of someone with enough patience and upper body strength, it might be enough to work loose the screws that held the deadbolt mechanism in place. The physical challenge was immense. His wheelchair limited his mobility and positioning options, making it difficult to get the proper leverage for the kind of sustained pressure he would need to apply. But years of adapting to his disability had taught him to approach problems from unexpected angles, to find solutions that able-bodied people might never consider. He would have to work in absolute silence during the hours when Fletcher was most likely to be unconscious upstairs. He would have to make progress in tiny increments, loosening screws by fractions of turns over days or weeks. And he would have to do it all while maintaining the pretense of resigned captivity, never letting on that he was planning anything beyond their daily survival routine. But first, he had to tell Iris what he was planning. "Little bird," he said, softly waiting until she finished her meager meal and looked at him with those enormous blue eyes. "I need to tell you about a special adventure we're going to take." Her expression sharpened slightly, some spark of interest flickering in the depths of her gaze. "An adventure?" "The most important adventure of our whole lives," he said, choosing his words carefully. He needed her to understand the seriousness of their situation without frightening her into panic or despair. "You remember the stories I've been telling you about the princess in the underground palace?" She nodded weakly. "Well, it turns out that the princess has been here long enough. She's learned everything she needs to learn, grown as strong as she needs to grow, and now it's time for her to leave the palace and explore the world above." Iris's eyes widened. "We're going upstairs?" "We're going to try," Kieran said honestly. "But it's going to be very difficult and very scary, and I need you to be the bravest princess who ever lived. Can you do that for me?" She considered this with the gravity of someone being asked to make a life-or-death decision, which in essence she was. After a long moment, she nodded. "I can be brave." "I know you can," he said, reaching out to stroke her pale cheek. "But first, I need to work on opening the door to our palace. It's going to take some time, and I'll need to work when it's very quiet, usually when you're sleeping. You might hear some small sounds, but you can't be afraid, okay? And if you hear footsteps upstairs, you need to let me know right away so I can stop working." "Are you going to break the door?" The question demonstrated an understanding that both impressed and heartbroken him. She knew they were prisoners. She understood that doors weren't supposed to lock from only one side, that children weren't supposed to live in basements without windows, that fathers weren't supposed to disappear for days at a time, leaving their children to starve. "I'm going to try to make it so we can open it," he said. "It might take a long time and I might not be able to do it at all. But I have to try, because—" He paused, searching for words that would convey the urgency without creating panic. "Because princesses aren't supposed to stay in underground palaces forever. They're supposed to go out into the world and help people and have adventures and see the sun." "I want to see the sun," Iris whispered, and the longing in her voice nearly broke his heart. "I dream about it sometimes. It's warm and bright, and it makes everything beautiful." "We're going to see the sun again," Kieran promised, though the words felt like tempting fate. "Both of us, together. But you have to help me by staying strong and being patient and trusting me, even when things seem impossible." She nodded solemnly, and he could see her trying to summon strength she didn't possess, courage that her weakened body could barely support. The sight of her determination in the face of such overwhelming odds filled him with a fierce protectiveness that transcended his own fear. That night, after Iris had fallen into the deep sleep of exhaustion, Kieran began his work. He positioned his wheelchair as close to the door as possible, studying the deadbolt mechanism in the dim light of their flickering bulb. The mounting plates were held in place by 4 screws each, 8 screws total standing between them and freedom. The screws were old, but not stripped, installed with the kind of electric drill that left clean threads and tight fits. But clean threads worked both ways. What could be tightened could also be loosened, given enough time and the right application of force. Kieran selected the broken spoon handle from his collection of improvised tools, testing its edge against one of the lower screws. The metal was harder than he had hoped, but softer than the screw head, which meant he could work without creating the kind of obvious scratches that might alert Fletcher to his activities. The first quarter turn took nearly an hour of patient, careful pressure. The screw fought him every millimeter, its threads locked tight after weeks of supporting the heavy deadbolt. His hands cramped from maintaining the precise grip needed to apply steady torque without slipping and creating noise. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the basement's chill. But it moved. Incrementally, almost imperceptibly, but it moved. By the time exhaustion forced him to stop, he had loosened the first screw by perhaps half a turn. It was pathetic progress measured against the enormity of their situation. But it was progress nonetheless. Proof that the impossible might merely be extremely difficult. He carefully cleaned any metal shavings from around the screw head, positioned his wheelchair exactly where it had been before, and hid his tools beneath his seat cushion. If Fletcher happened to check on them, an increasingly unlikely possibility, everything would appear exactly as it had for the past 27 days. The second night, he managed a full turn on the first screw and began work on the second. His hands were developing calluses from gripping the improvised tools, and his shoulders ached from the awkward angles required to apply pressure while seated in his wheelchair. But each small victory felt like a triumph against the forces that had imprisoned them. By the fourth night of work, he had loosened 2 screws significantly and begun to feel real hope for the first time since their captivity began. The metal was giving way to persistence, yielding to the kind of patient determination that had carried him through years of overcoming obstacles that others found insurmountable. But it was during that fourth night that Iris took a turn for the worse. He heard it first in her breathing, a slight rattle that hadn't been there before, a wetness in her lungs that suggested her body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions. When he wheeled over to check on her, her skin felt clammy and cool, and her pulse was rapid and thready. She was dying, slowly, quietly, without drama or fanfare, but dying nonetheless. The realization sent a surge of panic through his system that threatened to overwhelm his careful planning. All his patient work on the door meant nothing if Iris died before he could get it open. All his methodical progress was worthless if he had to watch his little sister fade away while he played with screws and door frames. He had to accelerate his timeline, take risks he had been avoiding, make noise he had been careful to prevent. Because saving Iris meant nothing if there was no Iris left to save. "Hold on, little bird," he whispered, stroking her fevered forehead with shaking hands. "Just hold on. Your big brother is going to get you out of here." He returned to the door with a desperation that transformed his careful engineering into frantic demolition. The broken spoon handle flew in his hands, working at the screws with a speed and force that sent small showers of metal shavings to the floor. He no longer cared about covering his tracks or maintaining the illusion of passive captivity. Iris needed medical attention, needed food and clean water and warmth and hope. She needed to see the sun again before it was too late. The first screw came free with a small metallic ping that seemed to echo through the basement like a gunshot. Kieran froze, listening for any sound from above, any indication that Fletcher had heard the noise and was coming to investigate. But the house remained silent, wrapped in whatever chemical stupor had claimed its owner. The second screw fought harder, its threads stripped by his hurried work, but it eventually yielded to brute force and determination. 2 screws down, 6 to go. By the time pale morning light began to filter through the basement windows, light that never reached their sealed room but which changed the quality of shadows under the door, Kieran had removed 4 of the 8 screws holding their prison together. The deadbolt mechanism was noticeably loose now, rattling slightly when he tested it, held in place by only half its original supports. But his hands were cramped into claws, his shoulders screamed with pain, and exhaustion was making his vision blur. Iris's breathing had grown more labored during the night, her skin more pale, her responses to his voice more delayed and confused. They were running out of time. "Today," he whispered to her sleeping form, though he wasn't sure she could hear him anymore. "Today we leave this place. Today we find help. Today we see the sun." Because the alternative, spending another night in this basement, watching Iris fade a little more with each passing hour, was unthinkable. The princess was going to rescue herself today, or she was going to die trying. There was no longer any middle ground between salvation and surrender. The final 4 screws surrendered to desperation and adrenaline in ways that patience and planning never could have achieved. As the first gray light of their 28th day of captivity filtered through the house above, Kieran worked with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb, knowing that every second of delay brought them closer to a catastrophe he couldn't bear to contemplate. Iris had not opened her eyes for over an hour. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps that seemed to echo unnaturally in their concrete tomb. When he pressed his ear to her chest, her heartbeat sounded like a bird's wing fluttering against glass, rapid, desperate, weakening. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality that made the blue veins beneath visible like delicate tracery on ancient parchment. She was dying, not in days or hours, but in minutes. The 7th screw came loose with a grinding screech that made Kieran's heart stop, certain that the sound would bring Fletcher thundering down the basement stairs in a rage that would end any hope of escape. But the silence above remained unbroken, as complete and profound as if the house were abandoned entirely. Perhaps it was. Perhaps Fletcher had finally fled whatever demons haunted his fractured mind, leaving them to die in forgotten solitude. The 8th and final screw fought him with the stubbornness of metal that had been over-tightened and corroded by years of basement moisture. His improvised tool slipped repeatedly, skinning his knuckles and leaving bloody smears on the doorframe. His hands shook with exhaustion and desperation, making the precise movements needed for leverage nearly impossible. But finally, mercifully, it yielded. The deadbolt mechanism sagged away from the doorframe like a sleeping predator, held in place now by nothing more than gravity and habit. Kieran stared at it for a long moment, hardly daring to believe that the barrier between them and freedom had been reduced to a few pounds of metal that could be lifted away with his bare hands. He turned back to Iris, his heart sinking as he saw how still she had become. For one terrible moment, he thought he was too late, that all his desperate work had been for nothing. But then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest, heard the whisper of breath through her slightly parted lips. Still alive. Barely, but alive. "Little bird," he whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "It's time for our adventure. Time to see the sun." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with fever, but aware enough to register his voice. She tried to smile, that automatic response that had sustained them both through weeks of hell, but the expression was ghostly, a shadow of the bright joy that had once lit her face. "Tired," she mumbled, the words slurred as if her tongue had forgotten how to form consonants properly. "I know, sweetheart. I know you're tired. But we're going to go somewhere warm and bright, where there are people who can help you feel better. Can you hold on to me?" She nodded weakly, and he carefully lifted her from her nest of blankets. The weight that settled into his arms was frighteningly light. She felt like a bird with hollow bones, fragile enough to break if he squeezed too tightly. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the fever burning through her thin clothing. The deadbolt lifted away from the doorframe as if it weighed nothing. 28 days of imprisonment defeated by 8 screws and the determination of a 9-year-old boy who refused to watch his sister die. The door swung open with a creak that sounded like freedom itself, revealing the basement stairs that led up to the world they had almost forgotten existed. But freedom was not as simple as an open door. The stairs rose before them like a mountain, each step a challenge that his wheelchair made seemingly impossible. He had known this moment would come, had planned for it during the long nights of working on the door mechanism. But the reality of the obstacle was more daunting than any theoretical problem he had solved in his mind. 14 steps separated them from the main floor of the house. 14 steps that might as well have been 14 miles for someone confined to a wheelchair and carrying a dying child, unless he thought like an engineer instead of a victim. Kieran positioned his wheelchair at the base of the stairs and studied the problem with the methodical approach that had gotten them this far. The stairs were old, built when houses were constructed to last, with solid wooden treads and sturdy handrails on both sides. The stairwell was narrow, barely wide enough for his wheelchair, but that might actually work in his favor. He would have to leave the wheelchair behind temporarily, carrying Iris up using only his arms and upper body strength. Then he would have to return for the chair, somehow getting it up the stairs, step by agonizing step. It would be exhausting, time-consuming, and risky, but it was possible. More than possible. It was their only chance. "Hold on tight, little bird," he whispered to Iris, adjusting her position in his arms so that her weight was distributed as evenly as possible. "We're going to climb a mountain together." The first step was the hardest, requiring him to pull himself up using the handrail while cradling Iris against his chest. His legs, atrophied from years of disuse, were dead weight that he had to drag behind him. But his arms, strengthened by years of self-reliance, proved equal to the task. Step by step, he hauled them both toward the world above. His shoulders burned with the strain, his lungs gasped for air in the dusty stairwell, and sweat stung his eyes despite the February cold that seeped through the old house's inadequate insulation. Iris's weight seemed to increase with each step, though he knew it was his own strength that was diminishing. Halfway up the stairs, he had to stop and rest, leaning against the wall while his heart hammered against his ribs. Iris stirred in his arms, her eyes opening to focus on his face with more clarity than she had shown in days. "Kieran?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was her voice, not the fevered mumbling of someone lost to delirium. "Right here, little bird. We're almost there." "Are we really going outside?" The question broke his heart and filled him with determination in equal measure. She had spent nearly a month imprisoned in a basement, and the idea of going outside had become as fantastical to her as fairy tales and magic kingdoms. "We're really going outside," he promised. "And then we're going to find people who will help us and take care of us and make sure we never have to be locked up again." She nodded against his chest, and he felt some of her tension ease, as if his promise had given her strength to endure whatever came next. The remaining steps passed in a blur of pain and determination. By the time he reached the top of the stairs, his vision was blurry with exhaustion, and his arms felt like they were on fire. But they had made it. They were on the main floor of the house, in territory that had been forbidden to them for 28 days. The kitchen stretched before them, a landscape of abandonment that told the story of Fletcher's deterioration more clearly than any words could have. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink and scattered across the counters, some growing mold that had turned them into abstract sculptures of neglect. Empty bottles, beer, whiskey, prescription medications covered every available surface like a museum display of self-destruction. The smell was overwhelming after weeks in their relatively clean basement prison. Rotting food, stale alcohol, unwashed clothing, and something else. Something chemical and wrong that made Kieran's nose burn and his eyes water. But most importantly, the house was empty. Fletcher was nowhere to be seen, and the silence had the quality of abandonment rather than sleep. Whatever had finally driven him away from his children, it had happened recently enough that the smell of his presence still lingered like a ghost in the stale air. Kieran carried Iris through the kitchen and living room to the front door, his heart sinking as he saw the multiple locks that Fletcher had installed on the inside. 3 deadbolts, 2 chain locks, and a police bar that would have made their home feel like a fortress or a prison, depending on which side of the locks you found yourself. But these locks were designed to keep people out, not in. They could be opened from the inside by anyone who knew how to work them. After 28 days of studying lock mechanisms and working with his hands, Kieran felt confident he could manage these obstacles. One by one he worked the locks open, balancing Iris against his chest while his free hand manipulated the hardware that had kept them sealed inside their own home. Each lock that opened was another step toward freedom, another barrier removed, between them and the help that Iris desperately needed. The final deadbolt clicked open with a sound like salvation itself. The door swung wide, and winter air rushed into the house like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of snow and possibility. Beyond the threshold lay a world transformed by the storm that had been building for days, a landscape of white that stretched as far as the eye could see, painted in shades of gray and silver, under a sky heavy with the promise of more snow to come. It was the most beautiful thing Kieran had ever seen, but it was also terrifying. The temperature was well below freezing, with a wind that cut through his thin clothing like knives. The snow was deep. At least 6 inches had fallen, with drifts that reached twice that height in places where the wind had sculpted the landscape according to its own artistic vision. Iris stirred in his arms, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the world beyond their prison. Snow was falling gently, each flake catching what little light filtered through the overcast sky and sparkling like tiny diamonds before settling onto the growing blanket that covered everything in. Sight. Snow, she whispered, wonder replacing the pain in her voice for just a moment. It's so pretty. It is pretty, Kieran agreed, though his mind was already calculating the challenges that the winter weather would add to their escape. But it's also very cold, so we need to get somewhere warm as quickly as possible. He set Iris down just inside the doorway, wrapping her in the heaviest blanket he could find, a thick wool throw that Fletcher had kept on the living room couch. She looked impossibly small, bundled in the oversized covering, like a fairy tale character lost in an enchanted forest. I have to go get my wheelchair, he explained, hating to leave her even for the few minutes it would take to retrieve it. I need you to wait right here and stay warm. Can you do that for me? She nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes at the prospect of being separated, even briefly, after they had been each other's only companions for so long. The return trip to the basement felt like descending into hell after tasting heaven. His legs were now completely useless, forced to drag his body down the stairs by his arms alone, knowing that the return journey with his wheelchair would be exponentially more difficult. Getting the wheelchair up the stairs was a nightmare of physics and persistence. The wheels caught on each step. The frame was awkward to maneuver in the narrow stairwell, and his exhausted muscles screamed in protest with every movement. But somehow, through a combination of brute force and stubborn refusal to give up, he managed to wrestle it to the top. By the time he made it back to the front door, nearly 20 minutes had passed, and Iris was slumped against the doorframe with the glassy-eyed stare of someone whose body was approaching complete shutdown. The brief spark of wonder that the snow had kindled in her eyes had faded back to the dull acceptance of someone too weak to fight anymore. Ready for the biggest adventure of our lives? He asked, lifting her back into his arms and settling into his wheelchair. She nodded weakly, and he wrapped the blankets around both of them as tightly as possible, creating a cocoon of warmth that would have to sustain them through whatever lay ahead. The first touch of his wheelchair wheels on snow was a shock of reality that nearly sent them sliding back into the house. The rubber tires, designed for smooth indoor surfaces and occasional outdoor use on pavement, had no traction whatsoever on the slick, uneven surface that winter had painted across their world. Every push forward was a battle against physics and weather. The wheels spun uselessly, sending up sprays of snow that melted immediately on his hands and made his grip on the wheel rims even more precarious. Within 50 feet of their front door, his hands were numb with cold and his shoulders were burning with the effort required to make any forward progress at all. But they were moving, slowly, awkwardly, leaving a strange trail in the snow that told the story of their passage, the parallel tracks of wheelchair wheels interrupted by areas where he had been forced to stop and rest, where the snow was disturbed by his efforts to find purchase on the slippery surface. Iris clung to him with what little strength she had left, her face buried against his chest to protect it from the wind and snow. He could feel her shivering through the layers of blankets, her small, body trying desperately to generate warmth it didn't have the resources to produce. The familiar streets of their neighborhood had been transformed into an alien landscape by the storm. Houses that he had known all his life were now anonymous shapes hunched against the winter sky, their windows dark and their driveways unplowed. The few streetlights that still functioned created islands of yellow illumination in the gray dawn, but between them lay stretches of shadow that could have hidden any number of obstacles or dangers. More troubling than the physical challenges was the complete absence of other people. At 3:30 in the morning on a winter weekday, Millbrook felt like a ghost town. No cars moved on the snow-covered streets, no lights showed in windows, no signs of life stirred anywhere in their field of vision. They were alone in a hostile world, two children with no resources and no help, racing against time and weather, and Iris's failing body to find salvation that might not exist. The first major obstacle came at the intersection of Elm and Maple, where a city plow had pushed a wall of snow across the sidewalk that stood nearly 3 feet high. Kieran stared at the barrier for a long moment, calculating angles and possibilities, before realizing that his wheelchair would never be able to cross it. He would have to go around, adding blocks to their journey and precious minutes to their race against time. Every detour was a gamble with Iris's life. Every delay another step closer to the point where her body would simply give up the fight for survival. The wind picked up as they turned down Maple Street, driving the falling snow horizontal and cutting through their inadequate clothing like frozen razors. Kieran's face went numb, then began to burn with the particular pain that comes just before frostbite sets in. He could no longer feel his hands on the wheel rims and had to look down to make sure he was still gripping them properly. Iris had stopped shivering, a sign that worried him more than any amount of trembling would have. When the body stops, generating heat through muscle contractions, it means the core temperature has dropped to dangerous levels. They had minutes, not hours, before hypothermia became irreversible. "Talk to me, little bird," he gasped, his own voice barely audible over the wind. "Tell me about your dreams. Tell me what you want to do when we get somewhere warm." But Iris didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her breathing so shallow it was barely visible, her small body limp in his arms like a rag doll that had lost its stuffing. Panic gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. His wheelchair began to move faster through the snow, leaving deeper tracks, creating a wake of disturbed white that marked their desperate passage through the sleeping town. His shoulders screamed in protest, his hands left bloody smears on the wheel rims where the cold had cracked his skin. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except getting Iris to warmth and help before her brave heart simply stopped beating. The businesses along Maple Street were all closed, their parking lots unplowed and their windows dark. The 24-hour diner that Kieran had been hoping to reach was shuttered, a handwritten sign in the window announcing that it was closed for renovations in letters that looked weeks old. His heart sank, but he pushed forward. Somewhere in this frozen wasteland, there had to be someone awake, someone who would help two children who were quite literally dying in the snow. Then, through the swirling white curtain of the storm, he saw it, a beacon of hope glowing like a lighthouse in a sea of darkness. The bright fluorescent lights of Riverside gas station cut through the snow and wind like a promise of salvation, illuminating the pumps and convenience store in a warm yellow glow that seemed impossibly welcoming after their ordeal. The station was at least 4 blocks away, across a stretch of unplowed street that looked like an ocean of snow. But it was open, it was warm, and most importantly, there was someone there, a figure moving around behind the brightly lit windows of the convenience store. "Almost there, little bird," Kieran whispered, though he wasn't sure Iris could hear him anymore. Almost there. The final push across the gas station parking lot nearly broke him. The deep snow made his wheelchair almost immobile, and he was forced to literally drag them forward inch by agonizing inch, using his hands to pull against anything solid he could reach. Light poles, the bases of gas pumps, the concrete islands that separated the driving lanes. His world had narrowed to a tunnel of pain and determination, bounded on one side by the warm lights ahead, and on the other by the growing certainty that he was about to watch his little sister die in his arms. Nothing else existed. Not the cold, not the snow, not the impossibility of what he was attempting. Only forward. Only the next few inches. Only the refusal to give up when giving up meant losing everything that mattered. The convenience store door seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds when he finally reached it, pushing it open with the last reserves of strength his body possessed. Warm air rushed out to greet them like an embrace from heaven itself, carrying with it the scents of coffee and heated food and hope. Inside, behind the counter, a woman with tired eyes and worry lines looked up from her paperwork with the expression of someone expecting trouble from whoever was entering her domain at this ungodly hour. Instead, she saw a 9-year-old boy in a wheelchair, holding an unconscious 3-year-old girl, both of them blue with cold and clearly in desperate need of help. Her expression transformed instantly from wariness to alarm, and she was around the counter and moving toward them before the door had even finished closing behind them. "Oh my God," she breathed, her hands already reaching for the blanket-wrapped bundle in Kieran's arms. "What happened to you? Where did you come from?" But Kieran was beyond speech, beyond explanation, beyond anything except the overwhelming relief of finally, mercifully, reaching safety. The warm air of the gas station felt like paradise after their journey through hell, and for the first time in 28 days, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually survive. "Please," he managed to whisper, his voice cracked and raw from the cold and the emotional strain of the night. "Please help us. My sister. She's very sick." The woman, her name tag read Delphine, was already in motion, her trained instincts taking over as she assessed their condition and began the process of warming them back to life. "I've got you," she said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who meant exactly what she said. "Both of you. You're safe now. Safe." After 28 days of imprisonment, after a journey through a frozen wasteland that had nearly claimed both their lives, after coming so close to losing everything that mattered, they were finally incredibly, impossibly safe. The princess had rescued herself, and she had brought her little sister home. Delphine Rousseau had been working the graveyard shift at Riverside gas station for 3 months, ever since her divorce had left her scrambling to make ends meet in a town where good jobs were as scarce as honest politicians. At 28, she felt decades older, worn down by the kind of life experiences that aged people from the inside out. A marriage that had crumbled under the weight of financial stress and incompatible dreams, a custody battle that had drained her savings and left her seeing her 6-year-old daughter only on weekends, and the grinding loneliness of working nights in a job where human contact was limited to drunks buying cigarettes and shift workers grabbing coffee. But nothing in her 3 months of late-night encounters with Millbrook's population had prepared her for the sight that greeted her when the convenience store door chimed at 3:47 a.m. on this snow-blown February morning. A child in a wheelchair, his face blue with cold and his hands bloody from gripping frozen metal, holding an unconscious little girl who looked more like a broken doll than a living child. Both of them were wrapped in blankets that had clearly been inadequate protection against the brutal winter storm, and both of them were shivering with the kind of deep, bone-rattling tremors that spoke of dangerously low body temperatures. Delphine's training as a former emergency medical technician kicked in before her conscious mind had fully processed what she was seeing. She had worked ambulances in Detroit for 4 years before moving to Millbrook, and she recognized the signs of severe hypothermia and malnutrition with the instant clarity that comes from experience with life and death situations. "Jesus Christ," she breathed, already moving around the counter with the efficient urgency of someone trained to act first and ask questions later. "How long have you been outside? Where did you come from?" But even as she asked the questions, she was conducting her own rapid assessment. The boy was conscious and responsive, though clearly exhausted and hypothermic. The little girl was unconscious but breathing, her pulse rapid and thready, when Delphine checked it at her thin wrist. Both children showed signs of prolonged malnutrition. Hollow, cheeks, prominent ribs visible even through their clothing, the kind of gauntness that didn't develop overnight. This wasn't a case of children wandering away from home and getting lost in the storm. This was something much more serious, much more wrong. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked the boy, already reaching for the emergency blankets she kept behind the counter for winter emergencies. Living in upstate New York taught you to prepare for situations exactly like this, though she had never imagined applying those preparations to children who looked like refugees from a war zone. "Kieran," he managed through chattering teeth, his voice hoarse and strained. "Kieran Brennan. This is my sister Iris. She's really sick. We need help." Delphine wrapped both children in the reflective emergency blankets, cranking the store's thermostat up to maximum while she considered her options. The little girl's condition was clearly critical. She needed immediate medical attention, possibly hospitalization. But there was something about the situation that set off alarm bells in her mind, something that suggested calling an ambulance might not be the complete solution these children needed. "Kieran, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to tell me the truth, okay? I'm here to help you, but I need to understand what's happened to you and your sister." She moved with practiced efficiency while she spoke, warming bottles of water in the coffee machine's hot water dispenser and preparing packets of electrolyte powder she kept for her own long shifts. Rehydration was critical for both children, but it had to be done carefully. Too much too fast could be dangerous in their weakened condition. "Where are your parents?" she asked, offering Kieran small sips of the warm, electrolyte-rich liquid. His face crumpled slightly, and she saw the weight of whatever trauma these children had endured settle back onto his narrow shoulders. "Our dad. He's been gone for days, maybe a week. He locked us in the basement, and then he disappeared." The words hit Delphine like a physical blow. Child imprisonment, criminal confinement, the kind of case that made headlines and destroyed families, and haunted the people who discovered it for the rest of their lives. "He locked you in the basement?" she repeated, needing to make sure she had heard correctly. "For how long?" 28 days, Kieran said with the precision of someone who had been keeping careful count. 28 days and 5 hours. The specific timing told her everything she needed to know about this boy's mental state. He had been tracking their imprisonment with the obsessive attention to detail that came from having nothing else to measure time against. 28 days of confinement would explain the malnutrition, the psychological trauma she could see lurking behind his determined facade, and the critical condition of his little sister. "Kieran," she said carefully, "I need you to know that what happened to you was not your fault, and it was not okay. Adults are supposed to protect children, not lock them away. You did the right thing by getting yourself and Iris out of there." He nodded, though she could see the complex emotions warring in his young face. Love and fear and anger and guilt, all tangled together in ways that no 9-year-old should have to navigate. "How did you get out?" she asked, continuing to offer him small sips of the electrolyte solution while monitoring Iris's vital signs. The little girl's breathing was becoming slightly more regular in the warmth of the store, though she remained unconscious. "I worked on the door lock," Kieran said with quiet pride. "It took me 4 nights, but I got all the screws loose and we could open it. Then we walked here through the snow." Walked. Delphine looked at his wheelchair, at the blood on his hands from gripping the frozen wheel rims, at the exhaustion written in every line of his small body. He hadn't walked. He had performed a heroic feat of endurance and determination that most adults would have found impossible. "You didn't walk, honey," she said gently. "You saved both your lives. You're a hero." But even as she spoke the words, her mind was processing the implications of what he had told her. Criminal confinement of children, systematic neglect, a father who had disappeared, leaving 2 children locked in a basement to starve. This wasn't a case for social services. This was a case for the police, for detectives, for the kind of investigation that required evidence and documentation and proof. "Kieran," she said, "I need to ask you something important. Do you have any way to prove what happened to you? Any evidence that shows you were locked in the basement?" His eyes lit up with something that might have been relief or vindication. Reaching into his jacket with hands that still shook from cold and exhaustion, he pulled out an old smartphone with a cracked screen. "I took pictures," he said simply. "Of our room, of Iris getting sick, of everything. I took pictures so people would know what happened to us." Delphine stared at the phone for a moment, understanding flooding through her with the force of revelation. This boy hadn't just endured 28 days of imprisonment, he had documented it. He had created evidence. He had thought ahead to the possibility that their story might not be believed, that proof might be necessary to ensure justice. At 9 years old, confined to a wheelchair, responsible for keeping his little sister alive, he had still possessed the presence of mind to gather evidence that would convict his abuser. "Can I see the pictures?" she asked softly. Kieran nodded, his small fingers working the phone's controls with practiced ease despite his hypothermic tremors. "The battery is almost dead, but there should be enough power to show you." The phone's screen flickered to life, and Delphine found herself looking at images that would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life. The first photograph showed a concrete room that looked more like a medieval dungeon than any place where children should be housed. A bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, damp walls, a bucket in the corner that she realized with sick horror was their only toilet. A thin mattress on the floor, a few cardboard boxes, the kind of Spartan prison cell that belonged in movies about political prisoners, not in the basement of a family home. The second photo showed the door from the inside, clearly displaying the heavy deadbolt mechanism that could only be operated from the outside. The industrial hardware, the way the metal plates had been screwed into the doorframe, the obvious intent to create a secure prison rather than a simple locked room. But it was the progression of photographs showing Iris that truly drove home the magnitude of what these children had endured. The early pictures showed a healthy, round-faced toddler with bright eyes and chubby cheeks. As the sequence continued, Delphine watched in mounting horror as the little girl's face grew gaunt. Her eyes became larger and more prominent. Her clothing began to hang loose on her shrinking frame. The final pictures, taken just days ago, showed a child who was clearly starving. Iris's cheeks were hollow, her ribs visible through her thin shirt, her eyes carrying the dull resignation of someone whose body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions. "My God," Delphine whispered, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the images. "Kieran, these pictures, they show everything. They prove what happened to you." But even as she spoke, her training was telling her what needed to happen. Next, these children needed immediate medical attention, police protection, and careful handling by people trained to deal with child abuse cases. The photos on this phone were evidence in what would undoubtedly become a criminal prosecution, and they needed to be preserved and protected. More than that, these children needed to be kept safe. If their father had abandoned them to die in a basement, there was no telling what he might do if he discovered they had escaped and were talking to authorities. "Kieran," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone making life-or-death decisions, "I'm going to help you and Iris. But I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" He nodded, though she could see the wariness in his eyes that came from having his trust betrayed by the one person who should have been most trustworthy. "I'm going to lock the store and put up a sign that says we're closed for emergency maintenance. Then I'm going to take you and Iris to the back office, where it's warmer and more private, and I'm going to call 911. The police and paramedics are going to come, and they're going to make sure you're both safe and that Iris gets the medical help she needs." She paused, looking directly into his eyes with the kind of steady gaze that children learn to trust when adults actually meant what they said. "And I promise you, both of you, that you will never be locked in a basement again." Whatever happens, next, whatever it takes, you're safe now. Moving quickly but carefully, Delphine locked the front door and flipped the sign to "Closed for emergency," then gathered both children and carried Iris to the back office while Kieran followed in his wheelchair. The office was cramped but warmer, with a space heater that she turned to maximum and a small couch where she could lay Iris down properly. The little girl's condition seemed to be stabilizing slightly in the consistent warmth, her breathing becoming more regular and her color improving marginally. But she was clearly still in critical condition, requiring medical intervention that was beyond anything Delphine could provide with her limited emergency training. 911, what's your emergency? This is Delphine Rousseau at Riverside Gas Station, on Maple Street in Millbrook. I have 2 children here who have been victims of criminal confinement and abuse. One is a 9-year-old boy in a wheelchair. The other is a 3-year-old girl who is unconscious and appears to be suffering from severe malnutrition and dehydration. I need police, paramedics, and child protective services immediately. Ma'am, can you repeat that? Did you say criminal confinement? The children have been locked in a basement for 28 days by their father, who then abandoned them. The boy managed to escape and carried his unconscious sister through a snowstorm to reach help. They have photographic evidence of their imprisonment, and the little girl needs immediate medical attention. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then the dispatcher's voice returned with the crisp efficiency of someone dealing with a priority emergency. Units are being dispatched now. Stay on the line with me. Are the children in immediate danger from their abuser? The father appears to have abandoned them days ago, but I don't know his current location or mental state. I've secured the children in my office and locked the store. Good. Paramedics should be there in approximately 8 minutes. Police in 5. Can you describe the children's current condition? Delphine provided a detailed medical assessment while keeping one eye on Iris and one hand on Kieran's shoulder, offering what comfort she could to a boy who had already proven himself capable of extraordinary courage and determination. The photographs, Kieran said urgently, holding up the phone. You have to make sure the police see the photographs. They prove what happened to us. I will, Delphine assured him. Those pictures are going to make sure your father can never hurt you or anyone else again. She took the phone carefully, understanding that she was handling evidence that would likely be crucial in the prosecution of Fletcher Brennan. The images told a story that no defense attorney could explain away, no plea bargain could minimize, no amount of mental health excuses could justify. A 9-year-old boy had documented his own imprisonment with the methodical precision of a war correspondent, creating an unassailable record of systematic child abuse that would ensure justice was served. The first siren became audible in the distance, growing louder as it approached through the snowy streets of Millbrook. Then another, and another, until the night air was filled with the sounds of emergency response converging on their location. They're coming, Delphine told Kieran, watching as relief and exhaustion warred in his young face. Help is coming, and you're both going to be okay. Red and blue lights began to flash through the store windows, painting the interior in alternating colors of urgency and authority. Car doors slammed, radios crackled with official communications, and the organized chaos of emergency response took over the quiet gas station. But in the back office, 2 children who had survived the unthinkable were finally, truly safe. The photographs that had captured their suffering would now serve as the foundation for their justice, and the courage of a 9-year-old boy who refused to let his sister die had brought them both home to a world where people cared enough to help. The princess had rescued herself, documented her own captivity, and lived to tell the tale that would ensure no other children would suffer as they had suffered. In the growing warmth of the gas station office, surrounded by the sounds of people who existed to help and protect and serve, Kieran Brennan allowed himself to believe, for the first time in 28 days, that everything was going to be all right. His photographs would make sure of it. Detective Cordelia Nash had seen enough child abuse cases in her 15-year career to develop what her colleagues called professional armor, the psychological protection that allowed her to process horrific crimes without losing her sanity. or her faith in humanity. She had worked cases involving neglect that bordered on torture, physical abuse that left permanent scars, and sexual crimes that haunted her dreams for months afterward. But as she stood in the back office of Riverside gas station at 4:23 a.m. on a snow-blown February morning, looking at a 9-year-old boy in a wheelchair who had just survived 28 days of imprisonment, she felt that armor cracking around the edges like ice under too much pressure. The paramedics had already taken Iris to Millbrook General Hospital, her small body swallowed by the adult-sized gurney like a doll, lost in a sea of white sheets and medical equipment. The oxygen mask covered half her pale face, making her look even younger and more fragile, while IV lines ran into her dehydrated veins carrying the electrolytes and glucose that her starved body desperately needed. The last image Nash had of the little girl was her pale hand reaching out weakly toward her brother as they loaded her into the ambulance, fingers stretched in a gesture of desperate connection, and Kieran's equally desperate promise shouted, over the sound of the engine, that he would see her soon, that everything was going to be okay now, that she was safe and would never be locked away again. Now, in the relative quiet that followed the organized chaos of emergency response, Nash sat across from Kieran in the cramped back office of the gas station, with a digital recorder between them on the small table and a heart that ached for what this child had endured. The office smelled of coffee and cleaning supplies, warmed by a space heater that hummed quietly in the corner, creating an atmosphere of safety and normalcy that stood in stark contrast to the horror story she was about to document officially. But more than her personal feelings of sympathy and outrage, she was struck by something else entirely: the methodical way Kieran had documented his own imprisonment, the clear thinking he had demonstrated under impossible circumstances, and the strength of character that had enabled him to not only survive 28 days of systematic abuse, but to engineer an escape that had saved both his life and his sister's. "Kieran," she said gently, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years learning how to talk to traumatized children, while also conveying the warmth that told them they were finally safe. "I need you to know that you did everything. Right. Everything. You kept yourself and Iris alive under conditions that would have broken most adults. You found a way out of what should have been an impossible situation. You got help when help seemed unreachable. And you even gathered evidence that's going to make sure your father can never hurt anyone like this again." The boy looked up at her with eyes that seemed far older than his 9 years, and she saw in them the kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving experiences that should never happen to children, the premature understanding of adult cruelty and adult failure that no child should have to carry. His hands were bandaged from his ordeal with the wheelchair in the snow, wrapped in white gauze that made them look even smaller and more vulnerable, and he was wrapped in hospital blankets that made him look like a refugee from some distant war zone rather than a child who had been imprisoned in his own basement. "The pictures," he said, his voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion, but still carrying the determined precision that seemed to define his character even in extremity. "Did you see all the pictures? All 23 of them?" Nash nodded, pulling out an evidence bag that contained the smartphone that had become the cornerstone of their case against Fletcher Brennan. The phone itself was a battered piece of technology that had somehow captured one of the most comprehensive records of systematic child abuse she had ever encountered. "I've seen them all, and I've had our technical team make multiple copies to preserve them across different formats and storage systems." "Kieran, those photographs are some of the most comprehensive documentation of child imprisonment I've ever encountered in 15 years of investigating these kinds of crimes. They're going to be crucial in making sure your father is held accountable for what he did to you and Iris." She had spent the past hour reviewing the images with a mixture of professional detachment and personal horror, trying to maintain the emotional distance necessary to process them as evidence while simultaneously fighting the urge to track down Fletcher Brennan herself and demonstrate what happened to adults who tortured children. The progression was methodical, almost scientific in its documentation of systematic abuse. Each photograph carefully composed and deliberately timed to show the deteriorating conditions and the children's declining health over the course of their imprisonment. The early photos showed the basement room in all its concrete bleakness, gray walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, the single bare bulb hanging from a frayed cord like a dying star, damp patches on the ceiling where winter moisture had seeped through the foundation. The heavy deadbolt mechanism that had kept 2 children prisoner was visible in several shots, its industrial-grade construction and professional installation making clear that this was not a moment of poor judgment, but a deliberate act of imprisonment designed to be escape-proof. The photos of their living conditions told a story of systematic neglect that grew worse over time. The bucket in the corner that served as their only toilet, a humiliation that violated every concept of human dignity. The thin mattress on the cold concrete floor, inadequate for 1 child, let alone 2. The cardboard boxes that contained their meager possessions and dwindling food supplies, the empty containers that marked Fletcher's increasingly sporadic visits, the calendar scratched into the concrete wall that showed Kieran's desperate attempt to maintain some sense of time and normalcy in their underground prison. But it was the photographs of Iris that truly demonstrated the magnitude of Fletcher Brennan's crimes against his own children. The sequence of images showed a healthy toddler transforming over weeks into a child on the brink of starvation, her face growing gaunt as subcutaneous fat disappeared, her eyes becoming too large for her shrinking features, her small body clearly failing under the stress of prolonged malnutrition and psychological trauma. The progression was subtle from day to day, but viewed as a sequence, it told the story of a 3-year-old child being slowly murdered by neglect and abandonment. "Tell me about your father," Nash said carefully, her pen poised over her notepad, while the digital recorder captured every word for the official record. "Before all this happened, what was he like? Help me understand how we got from there to here." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his small hands worrying at the edge of his blanket, with the nervous gesture of someone trying to organize complex and painful thoughts. When he spoke, his voice carried the conflicted emotions of a child trying to reconcile love with betrayal, protection with imprisonment, the father he had known with the man who had locked them away to die. "He used to be different," Kieran said finally, his voice soft with memory and loss. "Before Mom died, before he lost his job at the factory, he used to take us to the park every Sunday after church. He would push Iris on the swings and help me navigate the playground equipment that wasn't designed for wheelchairs. He read us stories every night, adventure stories about pirates and knights and explorers who overcame impossible odds. He made pancakes on Sunday mornings, and he taught me how to fix things, how to solve problems when something seemed impossible." The irony was not lost on Nash that Fletcher's lessons in problem-solving and mechanical engineering had ultimately enabled his son to engineer their escape from the prison he had created. The skills that a loving father had taught his disabled son to help him navigate an inaccessible world had become the tools that saved both children's lives when that same father became their captor. "When did things change?" Nash asked gently. "Can you pinpoint when your father started becoming the person who would lock you in a basement?" Kieran's expression grew more troubled, and she could see him struggling with the complex psychology of watching someone you love transform into someone you fear after the funeral, he said, his voice becoming smaller and more uncertain. "Mom died in a car accident last winter. A drunk driver hit her on her way home from work. Dad was different at the funeral, like he wasn't really there even though his body was standing next to the casket. After that, he started drinking more, staying awake all night, pacing around the house, and talking about people who were watching us, following us, planning to hurt us." Nash made careful notes, recognizing the classic pattern of grief-induced paranoid ideation complicated by substance abuse. She had seen similar progressions in other cases, though rarely with such devastating consequences. "He would stand at the windows with the curtains pulled back just a little bit, watching the street for hours," Kieran continued. "He said the government wanted to take us away, put us in foster care, split us up because I was disabled, and they didn't think he could take care of me properly. He said there were social workers and bureaucrats and other officials who were building a case against him, documenting every mistake, waiting for the right moment to swoop in and destroy our family. Did anyone actually contact your father about concerns regarding your care? Nash asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. No, Kieran said. I don't think anyone even knew we existed. After Mom died, Dad stopped taking us to church, stopped taking us to the park, stopped having any contact with the outside world. He homeschooled us, but that mostly meant giving us workbooks and leaving us alone while he drank and watched the windows. The isolation had created the perfect conditions for Fletcher's paranoia to flourish unchecked, Nash realized. Without external contact or reality testing, his fears had grown and mutated until they consumed his ability to think rationally about his children's welfare. The basement, she said gently. How long had he been talking about keeping you down there before he actually did it? A few weeks, Kieran replied, his voice growing more strained as he approached the heart of their ordeal. He kept saying it was temporary, just until he could figure things out and make sure we were safe. He installed the lock over several days, working on it mostly at night when he thought we were sleeping. He brought down some of our clothes and toys and books. He said it was like camping, like an adventure we would tell stories about someday. But it wasn't an adventure. No, Kieran said quietly. And Nash heard in his voice the death of whatever childhood innocence had survived. His mother's death and his father's deteriorating mental state. It was a prison, and after the first few days I think he knew it too. But he couldn't figure out how to undo it without admitting that he was wrong, that he had made a terrible mistake. So instead he just disappeared more and more, bringing us food less often, staying away for longer periods, until finally he stopped coming at all. The psychological insight demonstrated by the boy was remarkable, Nash thought. Despite his age and the trauma he had endured, he understood the adult complexities that had led to their imprisonment better than many adults would have been able to articulate. He had analyzed his father's mental state with the same methodical approach he had applied to escaping their prison. Tell me about the decision to escape, she said. What made you realize you had to get out, and how did you know you were capable of doing something that seemed impossible? Kieran's expression grew more serious, and she saw him glance toward the door as if he could see through the walls of the gas station to the hospital where his sister was fighting for her life, with the dedicated attention of medical professionals who understood that every minute mattered. Iris was dying, he said simply, and the matter-of-fact delivery of the statement somehow made it more powerful than if he had said it with obvious emotion. I could see it happening, day by day, hour by hour sometimes. She was getting weaker, sleeping more, eating less, even when we had food to eat. Her breathing changed. It got more shallow and rapid, like her body was working harder to do things that should have been automatic. I knew that if I didn't do something, she was going to die in that basement, and it would be my fault for not trying hard enough to save her. It wouldn't have been your fault, Nash said firmly, leaning forward to make sure he understood the absolute truth of what she was saying. None of this was your fault. You were a child being abused by an adult who was supposed to protect you. You had no responsibility for what happened to you, and you had no obligation to fix what your father had broken. But I was her big brother, Kieran replied, with a kind of fierce protectiveness that made Nash's chest tighten with emotion she wasn't supposed to feel while conducting an official interview. That made her my responsibility, regardless of whose fault it was that we were in that situation. I had to try because if I didn't try and she died, I would have to live with knowing that I gave up when she needed me most. The conversation continued for another hour, Nash carefully documenting every detail of their imprisonment, their father's deteriorating mental state, and the methodical escape that had saved both their lives. Through it all, Kieran answered her questions with a precision and clarity that would make him an exceptional witness when Fletcher Brennan eventually stood trial But more than that, he demonstrated a resilience and strength of character that amazed her. He described the painstaking process of loosening the deadbolt screws over multiple nights, working in complete silence while Iris slept, using improvised tools and engineering principles his father had taught him in happier times. He explained his decision-making process as Iris's condition deteriorated, the way he had calculated risks and resources and concluded that immediate action was necessary despite the seemingly impossible obstacles. Most remarkably, he talked about the photographs he had taken with the clinical detachment of a professional investigator, explaining how he had deliberately documented their conditions to create evidence that would be useful if they survived to tell their story. "I knew that adults sometimes don't believe children," he said matter-of-factly, "especially when children are accusing other adults of doing terrible things. So I tried to take pictures that would show what happened to us, even if nobody wanted to listen to what we said." And he would stand trial, Nash knew. She had already put out an APB for Fletcher Brennan, and the evidence Kieran had gathered made conviction virtually certain, even if they never found additional witnesses or corroborating evidence. The photographs alone were enough to support charges of criminal confinement, child endangerment, abuse, and neglect. Fletcher's mental state might be a factor in sentencing, but it would not excuse what he had done to his children, and it certainly wouldn't prevent conviction on multiple felony charges. "Detective Nash?" Kieran's voice interrupted her thoughts about prosecution strategy and evidence presentation. "What's going to happen to us now? To me and Iris? Where do we go from here?" It was the question she had been dreading, because the answer was complicated and uncertain in ways that no child should have to navigate, especially children who had already endured more uncertainty and fear than most adults experienced in their entire lives. With Fletcher missing, and likely to be arrested when found, both children would need to be placed in protective custody while social services worked out long-term arrangements that prioritized their safety, stability, and emotional healing. "First," she said, "Iris is getting the medical care she needs at one of the best hospitals in the region. The doctors at Millbrook General tell me she's responding very well to treatment, better than they initially expected given how serious her condition was when she arrived. Her vital signs are stabilizing, her blood work is improving, and they expect her to make a complete physical recovery. She's going to be fine, Kieran. You saved her life by getting her out of that basement and getting her to help when you did." Relief flooded the boy's face like sunrise breaking over a landscape that had been shrouded in darkness, and Nash saw some of the terrible tension he had been carrying finally begin to ease from his narrow shoulders. "As for what happens next," she continued, "we're going to make sure you're both placed somewhere safe, with people who will take care of you and love you, and never ever lock you up or hurt you or abandon you. Social services is already working on finding family members who can take you in, people who understand what you've been through and who are prepared to help you heal from it." "Together?" Kieran asked urgently, and Nash heard in his voice the same desperate need for connection that she had seen in his sister's reaching hand as they loaded her into the ambulance. "We stay together? They don't split us up?" "Together," Nash promised, though she made a mental note to ensure that social services understood the absolute importance of keeping these siblings united. After what they had been through, after the way they had taken care of each other through 28 days of imprisonment, separation would be another form of trauma that could undo much of their healing and recovery. Her phone buzzed with a text message from one of her officers, and she glanced at it quickly. "Fletcher Brennan located at Murphy's Tavern on West Street, unconscious from apparent drug overdose. Paramedics en route. Will be arrested upon medical clearance." Nash felt a grim satisfaction as she read the message. Fletcher Brennan would face justice for what he had done to his children, and the photographs Kieran had taken would ensure that justice was swift, comprehensive, and uncompromising. "Kieran," she said, "we found your father. He's alive, but he's very sick from drugs and alcohol, and he's going to be arrested as soon as the doctors say he's healthy enough to be taken into custody. That means he can't hurt you or Iris anymore, and you're both going to be safe from now on. He's never going to be able to lock you up again." The boy's reaction was complex. Relief mixed with sadness, fear tempered by something that might have been closure or vindication. Nash had seen similar reactions in other child victims, the conflicted emotions that came from loving someone who had caused terrible harm, the confusion of grieving for the parent they had lost even while celebrating the end of the abuse they had suffered. Over the next several hours, as dawn broke over Millbrook and the snow stopped falling, revealing a world transformed by winter, but somehow made more beautiful by the contrast between the white landscape and the warm lights of human habitation, the machinery of justice and child protection began to turn in earnest. Iris was stabilized at the hospital, her condition improving steadily with proper medical care, hydration, and nutrition. The pediatric team treating her marveled at her resilience, the way her small body responded to treatment despite the severity of her malnutrition. Within 24 hours, she was awake and asking for her brother, her personality beginning to emerge from beneath the trauma and physical exhaustion that had nearly claimed her life. Social services located Fletcher's sister Elena, who lived in Albany and had been trying to maintain contact with the children, despite Fletcher's increasing isolation and paranoia. Elena Brennan Rodriguez was a single mother and registered nurse who had been worried about her brother's mental state and her niece and nephew's welfare for months, even going so far as to make several unannounced visits to their house that Fletcher had rebuffed with increasing hostility and suspicious accusations. When she received the call from Child Services and learned what had happened to Kieran and Iris, she was on the road to Millbrook within an hour, determined to provide the stability and love that both children desperately needed after their ordeal. Their family, she told Nash when they met at the hospital that afternoon, her voice carrying the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood that family meant more than biology. They're my brother's children, but more than that, they're 2 kids who have been through hell and deserve every chance to heal and grow up safe and loved. I've been trying to help Fletcher for years, but he wouldn't accept it. Now I can help his children, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure they never have to be afraid again. Nash watched Elena interact with Kieran and saw immediately that this placement would work. The woman had the kind of calm competence that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies and traumatized patients. But more importantly, she had the genuine warmth and maternal instinct that both children needed to begin rebuilding their trust in adult caregivers. Elena's first meeting with Iris took place in the pediatric ward, where the little girl was still connected to IV lines, but sitting up in bed and coloring in a book that one of the nurses had provided. When Elena walked into the room, Iris looked up with the cautious curiosity of someone who had learned to be wary of adults, but hadn't yet lost the capacity for hope. "Are you my Aunt Elena?" Iris asked in a small voice. "I am," Elena replied, sitting down beside the bed at Iris's eye level. "And I've been wanting to meet you for a very long time. Your daddy used to tell me stories about how smart and funny and brave you were, but I think he didn't tell me the half of it." Nash watched from the doorway as Elena spent the next hour simply talking with Iris, asking about her favorite colors and foods and games, telling stories about the house in Albany where they would live, describing the cat she had recently adopted and the room she was already preparing with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling because she had heard that Iris liked to look at the sky. 3 days later, Nash stood in the courthouse as Fletcher Brennan was arraigned on multiple felony charges. He was pale and shaking from withdrawal, his eyes darting around the courtroom with the paranoid restlessness that had characterized his final descent into mental illness. His court-appointed attorney had clearly explained the severity of the charges and the strength of the evidence against him because Fletcher's shoulders sagged with what might have been recognition of the magnitude of his crimes. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "the defendant systematically imprisoned his own children for 28 days, leaving them to slowly starve in a basement room while he disappeared on drug binges lasting days at a time. The defendant installed industrial-grade locks to prevent the children from escaping, provided inadequate food and water, and ultimately abandoned them entirely. The only reason these children are alive today is because the 9-year-old victim managed to document their imprisonment, and engineer their escape using skills that his father had taught him in better times. The photographs were displayed on screens throughout the courtroom, each image a testament to the suffering Fletcher had inflicted and the strength his children had shown in surviving it. Nash saw several members of the gallery visibly react to the progression of images showing Iris's deterioration, and she knew that no defense strategy would be able to overcome the power of that visual evidence. Fletcher's attorney had clearly advised him against going to trial. The evidence was overwhelming, the photographs were unassailable, and Kieran's testimony would have been devastating to any defense strategy. Fletcher pleaded guilty to all charges, rather than subject his children to the trauma of testifying in open court about their imprisonment. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later, with victim impact statements from both children read into the record by Elena, who had been appointed their legal guardian. Kieran's statement was characteristically precise and thoughtful, acknowledging the complexity of his feelings about his father while making clear the lasting impact of their imprisonment. Iris's statement was simpler, dictated to Elena with the straightforward honesty of a 3-year-old. "Daddy scared us and hurt us, but Kieran took care of me and now we're safe." Fletcher was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 10 years contingent on successful completion of mental health and substance abuse treatment programs. The judge noted that while Fletcher's mental illness and grief were mitigating factors, they did not excuse the systematic nature of his crimes or the near-fatal consequences of his actions. But for Nash, the real victory was not Fletcher's conviction. It was what she witnessed 6 months later when she visited Kieran and Iris at Elena's home in Albany. The house was everything their basement prison had not been, bright and warm and filled with the sounds of normal family life. Elena had painted Iris's room in soft pastels with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, just as she had promised, while Kieran's room was organized with the kind of systematic efficiency that reflected his engineering mind, complete with a computer workstation, where he was already learning programming languages that most adults found incomprehensible. Iris had recovered completely from her physical ordeal, her cheeks once again round and healthy, her eyes bright with the kind of mischief that 3-year-olds were supposed to display. She chattered constantly about her preschool friends, her favorite books, and the cat that Elena had adopted specifically because Iris had fallen in love with it at the animal shelter. The basement and its horrors seemed like something from another lifetime, a nightmare that had been replaced by the ordinary magic of childhood. But it was Kieran who truly amazed Nash during her visit. The boy who had survived 28 days of imprisonment and engineered one of the most remarkable escapes she had ever encountered was thriving in ways that seemed almost miraculous. His grades in his new school were exceptional, his teachers describing him as remarkably mature and thoughtful for his age. He had been invited to speak to social workers and law enforcement officers about recognizing signs of child imprisonment, sharing his story with the kind of matter-of-fact courage that inspired everyone who heard it. "I've been thinking about becoming a detective," he told Nash during her visit, his eyes bright with possibility and determination. "Or maybe an engineer who works with law enforcement, designing better ways to investigate crimes. Elena says I can be whatever I want to be, and I want to help other kids who are in situations like we were." "You already are both," Nash replied, thinking of the methodical way he had documented their imprisonment and the brilliant engineering that had freed them from their concrete tomb. "You solved a case and saved 2 lives before you turned 10 years old. The rest is just getting the official training to match the skills you've already proven you have." Elena had enrolled both children in counseling to help them process their trauma, but she had also made sure they understood that their survival was something to be proud of, not ashamed of. The therapist working with them had noted their remarkable resilience and the strength of their sibling bond, recommending that their story be documented and shared as an example of how children could overcome even the most devastating circumstances when they had love and support. Iris was too young to fully comprehend what had happened to them, but Kieran carried his experience like a badge of honor, not because he enjoyed what they had suffered, but because he had proven to himself and the world that seemingly impossible, obstacles could be overcome with enough determination, ingenuity, and love. "The pictures I took," he said to Nash as they sat in Elena's sunny kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a family home where children were free to be children. "They helped other kids, didn't they? Other kids who were in trouble?" Nash nodded. Kieran's photographs had indeed become part of training materials used by law enforcement and social services agencies across the state, teaching professionals how to recognize and document cases of child imprisonment. His methodical approach to gathering evidence had set a new standard for how children's testimony could be supported and validated, and several ongoing investigations had been strengthened by techniques learned from his example. "They helped a lot of kids," she confirmed. "Your courage in taking those pictures and getting yourself and Iris to safety probably saved other children from going through what you went through. You turned your worst experience into something that protects other people." Kieran smiled, the first completely unguarded, purely happy expression Nash had ever seen on his face, free from the weight of responsibility and trauma that had aged him beyond his years. "Good," he said simply. "That's what big brothers are supposed to do. Protect people. And if I can't protect everyone directly, at least I can help other people learn how to protect them." As Nash drove back to Millbrook that evening, she reflected on the remarkable transformation she had witnessed. Two children who had been locked in a basement, systematically starved and abandoned by the person who should have protected them, above all others, had not only survived but flourished. More than that, they had turned their suffering into something meaningful, something that would help other children in similar situations and contribute to a better understanding of how to recognize and respond to child imprisonment. The case files would eventually be archived. Fletcher Brennan would serve his sentence in relative obscurity while hopefully receiving the mental health treatment that might have prevented the tragedy if it had been available earlier, and the system would move on to other crimes and other victims. But Kieran and Iris Brennan would carry forward the lessons they had learned in that concrete tomb. That family means protecting each other no matter what the cost. That impossible problems can be solved with patience and determination and love, and that documenting injustice is the first step toward ending it. They had been prisoners in a basement for 28 days, but they had emerged as something far more powerful. Survivors, advocates, and living proof that the human spirit can overcome even the most crushing circumstances when it is motivated by love and supported by people who understand that every child deserves safety, dignity, and hope. The princess had not only rescued herself and her little sister, she had ensured that other princesses would never have to face the same dragons alone, and that the adults responsible for protecting children would be better equipped to recognize when that protection was needed most desperately. In the end, that was perhaps the most important victory of all.